This is a reading from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, from the Message translation. He left there and returned to his hometown. His disciples came along. On the Sabbath, he gave a lecture in the meeting place. He stole the show, impressing everyone. We had no idea he was this good, they said. How did he get so wise all of a sudden, get such ability? But in the next breath, they were cutting him down. He's just a carpenter, Mary's boy. We've known him since he was a kid. We know his brothers, James, Justus, Jude, and Simon, and his sisters. Who does he think he is? They tripped over what little they knew about him and fell sprawling, and they never got any further. Jesus told them, a prophet has little honor in his hometown among his relatives on the streets he played in as a child. Jesus wasn't able to do much of anything there. He laid hands on a few sick people and healed them, that's all. He couldn't get over their stubbornness. He left and made a circuit of the other villages, teaching. Sometime in the last couple of weeks, in one of my social media feeds, I saw this question turned into a meme. How come nobody ever talks about the miracle that Jesus was in his 30s and he had 12 close friends? So I'm thinking that one obvious answer to that question is that, well, anyone I know in their 30s right now, man or woman, having 12 close friends, or even for that matter, having 3 close friends might well be a miracle. That just wasn't the case in Jesus' time and culture. From all that we know about Jesus' culture, we can assume that spending time together with your family, those with whom you grew up, those with whom you watched the sheep in the fields, those with whom you went to get water, that was something that happened on a daily and an hourly basis. It wasn't something that you had to schedule or make time for or prioritize. It was just there. Deep friendships grew naturally out of all that time together. I recognize that not all of us had friends when we were in elementary school or high school or college. But I think that for those of us who did have friends, who were gifted with friendships, I think that we would recognize that those that happened to us during our school years were closer and more woven into our lives than the friendships we made later on through work or community involvement. And I think that the depth of those friendships originated in the amount of shared experience that we had. We shared math tests, awkward gym classes, teachers who yelled, teachers who inspired, new routines for marching in marching band, chemistry explosions, whatever it was they were serving for lunch in the cafeteria that day, etc., etc. The sheer amount of time that we spent together put us in touch with each other's daily concerns, even those beyond school, like whether you had to go visit your grandparents every weekend, or whether you were going to make the swim team as a diver, or where you were thinking about going to college, or how your grade in differential equations was looking. So if you were to ask me, what does it take to create the miracle of friendship? I think my instinctual response would be it takes time and shared experience. Neither of which our culture grants us much of once we reach adulthood. There are certain circumstances where it comes to us. I think, for instance, of being a soldier, of being in the armed forces. And what's interesting about that shared experience, from what I understand, from what I read, from what people tell me, is that most soldiers, when they return from their service in the field, if you ask them what they fought for, they will say that they fought for their brothers and sisters in arms. Not for an idea, not for a political aim, not for freedom, but for the survival of those who fought alongside them. For friendship, in other words. And as we heard in the peace lecture at yearly meeting this year, one of the greatest ways in which soldiers are wounded after they return from battle is that they are separated from those friends. They do not return from the field as units who have fought together, but as individuals. And they are divorced from everyone on whom they have relied daily for support for the past year or 2 years or 5 years. And that's one of the greatest wounds of all. But I know that it's not the only place where we can see that kind of daily reliance on one another, where we can see friendship being formed by being in the same place at the same time. This is in no way, in any way comparable to a battlefield experience, yet back in the olden times when I was a teaching assistant in the communications photo lab at Syracuse University, the most difficult class I taught was a summer school class for graduate students in communications. Now, these were all students my age. We were all graduate students in the School of Communications in our mid-20s. And it was an intensive class where they were in the lab for at least 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. And they were all students whose major was something other than photography. Mostly journalism for either magazines or newspapers. Sometimes it was editing. There were maybe a couple in radio. They had been accepted into an extremely prestigious graduate school of communications. And they took this photography class because it fulfilled one of their requirements for some other thing other than their field, and they believed that it would be easy. And they were surprised and dismayed and frustrated and angry when they discovered that it was not easy. And it wasn't just difficult on a brain level of difficulty, it was difficult on a physical level. There were ways in which they had to train their hands to a skill they were not experienced with, and they just couldn't believe that it was so much work with so little payoff. And so this class of adults, as I said, in their mid-20s, regressed to the level of kindergartners. I sat at a desk in the middle of the photo lab. Behind me and in front of me, there were long corridors of darkness. On either side of the corridor in front of me, there were the small developing rooms, about closet-sized. And then beyond those, there were 2 large printing rooms that were dark all the time. They were about at least 20 yards away from me. And that's where the grad students, my grad students, were working most of the time. And they would stand in one of those dark rooms with multiple walls between us, and they would yell my name from 20 yards away in 3 walls to get me to come back there to look at what they were doing in the dark room. Or they would come out to my desk where people were standing in a line, and they would cut in line. And they would all say my name at the same time, and if none of this worked, some of them would grab my hand and start to drag me back to the dark room. And because these were students my age, I had no idea how to get them to grow up. I was just baffled all the time at this behavior, especially the cutting the line and the complete lack of politeness or manners. I just didn't know how to deal with it. But I did come to see them, a different side of them, a more competent side of them, on the day that I was teaching them about how to dry mount a print to a piece of mat board. And so when you dry mount a print, 2 pieces of matte board, first you have to take it from, like, say it's 8 by 10 piece of paper, you have to cut it down to 6 by 9, which is what it probably is. And you can do this with a paper cutter, but a paper cutter will inevitably give you a cut that isn't square. And so I was encouraging them to use an X-Acto knife, which is like a craft knife with a small blade, and a ruler, because that's really the only way that you can do it straight. And I cut off the edge of my finger. And I was not really aware of this at the time. It was a very sharp blade. I had just encouraged them to always use a sharp blade. It was a very sharp blade. I felt a little bit of a sting, and I didn't want to stop the lesson, so I just thought I'd go on, and somewhere back there I heard a voice say, "Dan, you're bleeding." And I kind of paused, still not knowing what to do, because they don't teach you this in Graduate Teaching Assistant 101. Somebody said, "Go to the restroom and run your hand under cold water." So I went to the restroom and ran my hand under cold water, and by this time there was copious blood coming out from my finger. And one of the graduate students came in with some Band-Aids and bandaged up my finger a lot. And I came back into the desk area, and I saw that some of them were cleaning blood off the floor with towels, and they were in general displaying a kind of competence that I had not seen in them ever before. In fact, to do these things, they had to break into the locked equipment cage that they were never allowed to be in order to get the towels. And to find the first aid kit that they had used to bandage me up with. And they had done all that and made sure that I was okay, although I did notice as the semester wound up that none of them ever used an X-Acto knife to cut their prints with. They all had crooked prints when it came to mounting. None of them ever used an X-Acto. But in the other scheme of things, they had showed some general competence in taking care of me. And it was a competence that, based on my previous experience, I never would have expected from this group of people. And I think that I still find it curious because of the way they just kind of suddenly became competent to take care of my finger, for several reasons. For one thing, they could have viewed me as the enemy, since I was constantly making them do things that they couldn't do correctly and couldn't do very well. But if we go back to my theory of friendship, this is what we would expect. We spent countless hours together in a very intensive way with a shared experience. And when push came to shove, they treated me as though I were part of their platoon of soldiers. And they sprang into action when a comrade was wounded. We could think that because our culture prioritizes success and mobility and prosperity over friendship, that friendship is just one of multiple options in life, and whether or not we choose friendship is simply a matter of personality and individual choice. But I think that story from the Gospel of Mark with which I began shows that friendship is integral to what we are actually able to do in our lives. In a place where nobody believes in Jesus, where no one is rooting for Jesus, Jesus' capacity to do miracles is not as great as it is in other places. And later on in that same chapter, and this is not, I think, an accident, about 15 verses later in the chapter is the passage where Jesus tries to get his friends to come away on a retreat, and the people follow them. They come to listen to Jesus. He gives them a teaching lesson, and then everybody is hungry. And he tells his disciples to feed them, and his disciples say how, and the little kid offers a few loaves and fishes, and they get multiplied. And this huge miracle occurs really based on friendship, based on the people who believe in Jesus, who lift him up, who surround him with care. So that's what happens in a culture where friendship is an everyday occurrence. What's the lesson for our culture where friendship is more and more an oddity? I think one thing is that they point to one of the gifts that the church in particular has to offer to our culture. In the United States these days, people are literally dying of loneliness. Throughout all age groups, but particularly for people over the 40s, there is a constant increase in what public health officials describe as deaths of despair. Deaths caused by suicide, alcoholism, and other forms of addiction. The kinds of death that happen to people who feel they have no reason to live and no one to whom they are important. The difficult thing, knowing that friendship is what the church has to offer, the difficult thing is, though, that the church isn't able to provide the kind of friendship that would be an antidote to this despair in only 1 or 2 hours a week. I think it can only provide that kind of friendship through time together and shared experience. And if you think back to the time when all of us were young, you can probably remember groups like, well, I don't know what the groups would be here. I remember groups like the Sons of Canute and Knights of Columbus and the Eagles, all these quasi-church social fraternal orders. We probably remember church-run rummage sales. I'm sure that we remember fish fries and pork chop dinners. Chicken dinners also, yes. I know that at Dover, for many, many years, until they got too small, you know where they're located out there, about 2.5 miles away from the McDonald's. They used to go out for breakfast every single Sunday after worship, which at that time would have been lunch, but breakfast, lunch, all of them went there afterwards. You can have a small group experience that meets weekly for a couple of hours. But I think maybe the real benefit of the pork chop dinner or the chicken dinner is not that it's a fundraiser. I know it's always said that it's a fundraiser. I think it's in the hundreds of hours that it takes to prepare it, which brings the church together in shared work, which is where the friendship comes in. Or maybe if it was a church that did a rummage sale, it was all of the packing and unpacking of other people's clothes and books. Who knows? But the reason that I'm having these thoughts about why doesn't anybody talk about the real miracle being that Jesus was a man in his 30s with 12 close friends. The reason I'm having these thoughts is because I know from my own experience as a campus minister and as a minister to adults in their 20s and 30s and 40s that question about Jesus having 12 close friends, that's not some idiosyncratic question raised by some particularly luckless or unappealing young adults. This is a question raised by every young adult I've known who lives elsewhere than the place where they grew up, which at this point is a really high percentage of young adults. And it's a question that the church is an answer to, and which, if we did answer, would really go some way toward bringing the kingdom of God to earth, which is the work Friends believe we should be engaged in. But this is the question for us. How are we going to provide that friendship?